My parents drained my life savings to buy a luxury house for my sister. They thought they left me with nothing. So I sat back and smiled, knowing they had just stolen from a heavily monitored federal corporate tax account. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The fever had been burning through me for 3 straight days. At 34, I prided myself on my relentless work ethic. As an independent corporate financial auditor, my life was a meticulously organized spreadsheet of deadlines, compliance checks, and client meetings. I didn't have time to be sick, but the brutal strain of pneumonia I had caught in late March didn't care about my schedule. It had completely leveled me, leaving me bedridden, shivering under a mountain of heavy blankets in my darkened bedroom, my lungs rattling with every shallow breath. I was physically weak, more vulnerable than I had been in a decade. My head pounded with a relentless, throbbing ache as I reached blindly for my phone on the nightstand. It was supposed to be a simple, routine check. It was the 15th of the month, the day I always verified the automated transfers for my business overhead and tax-holding accounts. My eyes were completely blurry, struggling to focus against the harsh, blue glare of the screen in the dim room. I opened my secure banking application, my thumb trembling slightly as it rested on the biometric scanner. The little loading circle spun for what felt like an eternity. When the dashboard finally loaded, I blinked, thinking the fever was causing me to hallucinate. I rubbed my burning eyes with the back of my hand and stared at the screen again. My primary corporate holding account, the one specifically designated for my impending quarterly estimated tax payment to the IRS, which I treated as a secondary, untouchable savings until the tax deadline, was empty. I don't mean it was slightly lower than expected. I mean it had been utterly decimated. The balance, which had sat at exactly $185,000 just 48 hours prior, now read $12.45. My breath caught in my throat, triggering a violent fit of coughing that sent sharp, stabbing pains through my ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced right through the fever haze. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning wildly. I tapped on the account details, my fingers clumsy and frantic. There it was. A massive, outbound wire transfer. Amount, $184,987. $55. Status, cleared. I clicked on the transaction history to view the routing details. The authorization signature line made the blood freeze in my veins. The transfer hadn't been a hack. It hadn't been a glitch. It was authorized by a name I knew better than my own. Helen. My mother. A wave of intense nausea washed over me. Decades ago, when I was an 18-year-old freshman in college, my mother and father, Benjamin, had set up a joint account for me to help manage my meager part-time income and student loans. When I started my first consulting LLC years later, in a rush of naive convenience, I had simply repurposed that old, dormant account to hold funds temporarily, completely forgetting that my parents' names were technically still lingering on the archaic legacy charter at that specific local credit union branch. I had assumed it was a dead issue. I had assumed they would never touch it. I stared at the screen, the glowing numbers burning into my retinas. The sheer magnitude of the theft was incomprehensible. They hadn't just taken a little. They had taken everything they could reach. As the realization of what my own mother and father had just done washed over me, the physical illness tearing through my body suddenly felt entirely insignificant. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. I didn't call the bank first. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too violently to dial the fraud department's complex numeric prompts. Instead, driven by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline that momentarily overpowered the pneumonia, I found my mother's contact in my phone and hit send. It rang twice before she answered. Isabella. Goodness, I was wondering when you'd finally wake up and look at your phone, Helen's voice chirped through the receiver. It was bright, breezy, and entirely devoid of guilt. It was the exact tone she used when she was discussing the weather or what she was making for dinner. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Mom," I croaked, my voice sounding like crushed glass due to my raw throat. "Where is the money? The transfer from the holding account. Where did it go?" "Oh, sweetheart, don't use that tone," Helen sighed, a sound of mild, practiced disappointment. "Benjamin and I were going to tell you, but you haven't been answering your texts all week. We knew you were just lying in bed with a cold, so we handled it for you." "Handled what?" I rasped, struggling to pull air into my lungs. "You took almost $200,000, Mom. That wasn't yours to take." "Now, Isabella, calm down. You know it's not good for your health to get worked up," my father, Benjamin, suddenly interjected. I could hear the rustling of the newspaper. He was on speakerphone in their living room. "Your sister, Quinn, and Gabriel finally found it. The absolute perfect house in the gated community they've been wanting. The market is so competitive right now, Isabella. The seller wanted a massive cash down payment to bypass the mortgage contingencies. They were going to lose it." The room began to tilt. "Quinn's house." I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Gabriel is an entrepreneur, Isabella. His assets are tied up in very complex investments right now," Helen explained, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "They couldn't liquidate in time, and you. Well, you've been doing so well with your little consulting business. We checked that old account we helped you set up, and there it was, just sitting there, doing nothing. We knew you wouldn't mind helping your little sister secure her future. You have plenty of savings, Isabella. You don't need all of that." "You stole from me," I said, my voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "You committed wire fraud." "Don't be so dramatic," Benjamin barked, his temper flaring instantly. "We are your parents. We gave you life, we raised you, and we are still on the paperwork for that account. It's family money, Isabella. You've always been so selfish with your success. Quinn is 28. She needs a proper home to start a family with Gabriel. You're single, you live in an apartment. What do you need nearly 200 grand sitting around for? We made an executive family decision. Be happy for your sister for once." "We'll pay you back eventually, sweetie," Helen added, though the hollow flippancy in her voice made it clear that eventually meant absolutely never. "Gabriel's business is going to take off any day now. Just rest up, drink some tea, and we'll have you over for dinner at Quinn's new place once they move in. Love you." The line went dead. A dial tone echoed in my silent, dark bedroom. I slowly lowered the phone. My chest heaved as I fought back a sob, the sheer audacity and entitlement suffocating me. They truly believed they had a right to my labor. They thought they had crippled me financially, draining what they assumed was my life savings to fund Quinn's extravagant lifestyle, just as they had always demanded my time and resources in the past. They thought they had taken my life savings. They thought they had left me destitute. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. To understand how my parents could be so callously entitled to my money, you have to understand the dynamic that had ruled our family for 3 decades. I was the workhorse. Quinn was the show pony. When I was 16, I worked 3 after-school jobs to buy my own beat-up sedan, while my parents surprised Quinn with a brand-new convertible for her high school graduation, taking out a second mortgage to afford it. When I was eating ramen in my tiny college dorm to avoid taking out more loans, they were paying for Quinn's lavish gap year, backpacking trips across Europe. I was the one who bailaid Benjamin out when he was laid off from his middle management job, paying their property taxes for 6 months so they wouldn't lose their house. I sacrificed my 20s building my consulting firm from the ground up, missing holidays and birthdays, while they celebrated Quinn's fleeting, constantly changing hobbies as if she were a child prodigy. But things had escalated significantly when Gabriel entered the picture 2 years ago. Gabriel was 30 years old, fiercely handsome, and impeccably polished. He wore tailored suits to casual Sunday brunches and sported a heavy gold watch that he made sure everyone noticed. When asked what he did for a living, he never gave a straight answer. He was a crypto entrepreneur, a wealth synergy facilitator, or a venture capital scout. He used a lot of buzzwords that sounded impressive to Benjamin and Helen, but to a financial auditor like me, they were massive, glaring red flags indicating a man who produced absolutely nothing of value. From the moment he realized I owned my own successful financial firm, Gabriel's focus on me had been relentless and deeply inappropriate. I remember last Thanksgiving vividly. I was in the kitchen, exhausted after a 60-hour work week, washing dishes while the rest of the family drank wine in the living room. Gabriel had cornered me by the sink. He smelled strongly of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey. "So, Isabella," he had purred, leaning uncomfortably close, his eyes darting over me like I was a spreadsheet he was trying to crack. "Quinn tells me your firm had a banner year. You must be pulling in some serious capital. Where are you parking all that liquidity? Real estate, offshore trusts. You shouldn't leave it in standard accounts, you know. Inflation eats it alive. I could help you diversify. Get you into some high-yield alternative assets." "I manage my own portfolios, Gabriel," I had replied stiffly, stepping away from him. He had chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on my nerves. "Just trying to keep the wealth in the family, Isabella. You work too hard. You should let your money work for you, and for us. Family has to stick together, right? Build an empire." His questions had never stopped. At every holiday, every forced family gathering, Gabriel would probe. He asked about my LLC structure, my tax brackets, the names of the banks I used. I had always shut him down coldly, but I realized now, sitting in my bed with a fever raging and my account drained, that I hadn't shut him down completely. He had clearly pumped Helen for information. He had found out about that old, forgotten legacy account at the local credit union. Gabriel, with his empty pockets and grand delusions of luxury, couldn't afford the gated community house he had promised Quinn. So, he had manipulated my parents. He had convinced them that I was hoarding family wealth and that they had every moral right to take it to secure his and Quinn's future. He had orchestrated this entire theft, using my parents as his willing, entitled accomplices. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted the workhorse. I slowly pushed the heavy blankets off my shivering body and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet hit the cold hardwood floor. I was still sick, I was still weak, but a new, profound sense of cold clarity was washing over me, completely erasing the panic. I walked unsteadily over to my home office desk and powered on my encrypted work laptop. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk, the chilled air of my apartment doing nothing to cool the fever still burning beneath my skin. The bright glare of my encrypted work laptop illuminated the dark room, casting harsh shadows against the walls. I pulled my thick fleece blanket tighter around my shoulders, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic, desperate energy. I didn't call the bank's standard customer service line. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what my parents had done, but more importantly, I knew exactly what they had unknowingly walked into. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct, unlisted cell phone number of my corporate attorney, Marcus. He was a ruthless, brilliant lawyer who handled my firm's most complex compliance issues. He answered on the second ring. "Isabella, it's Thursday evening. You're supposed to be on medical leave." "You sound like you've been gargling gravel," Marcus said, his deep voice laced with immediate concern. "Marcus," I rasped, struggling to keep my breathing even. "I need you to pull up the dashboard for the primary LLC operating portal. Look at the quarterly tax holding ledger. The Q1 estimated federal tax account." I heard the rapid clacking of his mechanical keyboard through the speaker. A heavy, tense silence stretched over the line for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, Marcus let out a sharp, breathless exhale. "Isabella, it's completely zeroed out. $184,000. There is an outbound wire trace. Who in the world authorized a manual wire transfer from a restricted federal tax holding account?" "My mother," I whispered, closing my eyes as a fresh wave of nausea hit me. "And my father. They used the legacy charter from a joint account they set up for me when I was a teenager. When I founded the LLC, I attached that charter to the corporate profile to expedite the initial funding deposits. I never removed their authorization credentials." "Good heavens," Marcus murmured, the professional shock evident in his tone. Isabella, do they understand what they just did? They didn't just drain your personal savings. They breached a corporate firewall. Those funds are heavily monitored. They are specifically earmarked for the Internal Revenue Service. By initiating that wire, they didn't just steal from your business, they intercepted federal tax funds. The bank's automated algorithms will flag a transfer of that magnitude, from a corporate tax hold to a personal real estate escrow account within 24 hours. I know, I said, a dark, terrifying calmness settling over me. It's wire fraud, it's corporate embezzlement, and it crosses federal lines. The moment that wire hits the clearinghouse, the Treasury Department is going to freeze it, Marcus explained, his voice turning strictly to business. The funds won't clear into whatever escrow account they sent it to. It will be locked down pending a full federal fraud investigation. Isabella, I have to report this to the fraud department immediately to protect your firm's liability. Do it, I commanded, my voice gaining strength. Lock it all down, but Marcus, I need something else from you. I need you to grant me temporary access to your firm's premium background investigation database, the deep dive forensic one. Who are we looking into? He asked. My sister's boyfriend, I said, my eyes narrowing at the screen. Gabriel, he orchestrated this. I need to know exactly who he is. Within 5 minutes, I had the login credentials. I spent the next 3 hours ignoring my pounding headache and rattling lungs, diving deep into the digital footprints of Gabriel. He had always claimed to be a wealth synergy facilitator, but as I ran his name, his date of birth, and his previous addresses through the forensic database, a horrifying, undeniable pattern emerged. Gabriel was not an entrepreneur. He was a professional parasite. I downloaded court documents, civil judgments, and suspended LLC filings. He had 3 bankruptcies. He had 2 civil judgments against him in different states from women who had sued him for unpaid personal loans. He would find a woman with good credit, convince her to invest in his startups, drain her resources, and vanish when the debt collectors came calling. Now he had set his sights on Quinn, but more accurately, he had set his sights on what he assumed was my easily accessible family wealth. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he had outsmarted a woman who literally dismantled complex corporate fraud for a living. I hit print on my heavy-duty office printer, watching as 60 pages of Gabriel's deceitful history slid into the output tray. The trap was set. The loud, obnoxious buzzing of my apartment intercom startled me awake the next morning. I had fallen asleep at my desk, my head resting on the thick stack of printed documents. My joints ached, and my throat felt like sandpaper, but the adrenaline from the night before had crystallized into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I pressed the intercom button. Yes. Surprise! Quinn's high-pitched, overly excited voice blasted through the speaker. We brought you soup, big sister, and champagne, let us in. They had the audacity to come to my home. They had stolen my money less than 24 hours ago, and they were here to celebrate. I pressed the unlock button, my hand remarkably steady. I gathered the printed dossier, placed it carefully in a manila folder, and walked out to my living room, wrapping my thick blanket around myself like a layer of armor. The door swung open, and they paraded in. Quinn was practically vibrating with excitement, holding a bottle of expensive champagne. My mother, Helen, carried a plastic container of lukewarm soup, beaming with a sickeningly sweet smile. My father, Benjamin, walked in with his chest puffed out, looking around my modest, practical apartment with a poorly concealed look of pity. Trailing behind them all was Gabriel. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit, smirking as he stepped over my threshold. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. Isabella. You look simply awful, sweetheart, Helen cooed, setting the soup on my kitchen counter. We couldn't let you be sick and miserable on such a joyous day. The seller accepted the offer. The house is ours. Technically, it's Quinn and Gabriel's, Helen, Benjamin corrected proudly, clapping Gabriel on the shoulder. But it's a victory for the whole family. We took the liberty of getting the paperwork moving. The escrow company said the funds should clear any minute now. I stood perfectly still in the center of my living room. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stared at them, letting their hollow, ignorant celebration fill the quiet space. You didn't take my savings, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through their chatter like a sharpened blade. The room instantly fell dead silent. Quinn lowered the champagne bottle, her smile faltering. Helen blinked, her hands fluttering nervously in front of her. Now, Isabella, let's not do this, Benjamin warned, his face darkening with immediate irritation. We explained this on the phone. You had nearly $200,000 doing absolutely nothing in a defunct account. You don't need it. Your sister does. End of discussion. You don't understand, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. I didn't say you shouldn't have taken it. I said you didn't take my savings. That account you drained. It wasn't a personal savings account. It was the Q1 estimated federal tax holding account for my limited liability company. Gabriel's smug smile vanished instantly. His posture stiffened, his eyes darting toward me with sudden, sharp alarm. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice losing its smooth, polished edge. It was a standard joint checking account. We saw the legacy charter. The charter was a placeholder, I explained calmly, my gaze fixed directly on Gabriel. When I incorporated my business, I tied that specific account to my corporate tax profile to hold my quarterly IRS payments. The money you wired yesterday wasn't my personal wealth, Gabriel. It was money legally earmarked for the federal government. You didn't steal from me. You stole from the United States Treasury. You're lying. Gabriel spat, taking an aggressive step forward, his polished facade cracking completely. That's illegal. You can't hide personal wealth in a corporate tax shell to avoid sharing it with your family. I know how banks work, Isabella. The wire already cleared the front end. I never hid anything. I'm a corporate financial auditor, I reminded him, my voice dripping with icy condescension. I follow the law to the letter. You, however, do not. The front end shows cleared, but the back end clearinghouse flagged the transaction at 3:00 a.m. this morning. A transfer of $184,000 from a heavily regulated corporate tax hold to a random residential escrow account triggered an automatic federal freeze. Helen gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. A freeze? What does that mean, Isabella? We need that money to secure the house by noon today. It means, I said, looking at my mother with absolutely no sympathy, that the money is gone, locked in a federal vault. And the bank's fraud department is currently opening an investigation into whoever signed the authorization for that wire transfer. Absolute panic erupted in my living room. Gabriel aggressively pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking as he furiously dialed a number. He paced back and forth across my rug, barking into the phone. Yeah, it's Gabriel. Check the escrow portal. What do you mean it's locked? Call the bank. Force it through. I don't care what the compliance department says, it's cash. He ended the call, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. He looked at Benjamin, panic wild in his eyes. The escrow agent says the receiving account has been frozen by a federal compliance order. They're threatening to pull the house offer. Isabella, fix this right now. Benjamin roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He pointed a trembling finger at me. Call your bank. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them it was a family gift. I can't, I said, folding my arms across my chest. A corporate entity cannot gift $184,000 to a sibling to buy a house. That is textbook embezzlement. By signing that wire authorization, Mom, you committed wire fraud across state banking lines. You committed corporate theft. No, 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 Helen whimpered, tears welling up in her eyes as she sank onto my sofa. We were just trying to help Quinn. Gabriel said it was perfectly legal. Gabriel said you were just hoarding family resources. Gabriel lied to you, I stated firmly, just like he lies to everyone. Quinn, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly rushed to Gabriel's side, grabbing his arm defensively. Don't you dare talk about him like that, Isabella. You're just jealous. You're trying to ruin my dream house because you're miserable and alone. Gabriel is a brilliant businessman. He just hit a snag. A snag? I repeated, almost laughing at the profound delusion. I reached down and picked up the thick manila folder I had placed on the coffee table. Quinn, Gabriel isn't a businessman. He's a professional con artist. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, dropping it onto the glass table with a heavy thud. Gabriel Thorne, or should I say, Gabriel Vance, or Gabriel Mercer. I listed, reading the aliases from the top sheet. Let's look at his brilliant business history. 3 corporate bankruptcies in the last 5 years, all of them shell companies with 0 actual revenue. Stop it, you fabricated that. Gabriel shouted, lunging forward, but Benjamin threw an arm out, stopping him. My father was staring at the documents on the table, his breathing heavy and ragged. I didn't fabricate the civil judgments, Gabriel, I continued, pulling out the court transcripts. Judgment 1, Sarah Jenkins, 32 years old. Sued Gabriel for $40,000 in unpaid loans she took out to fund his wealth synergy startup. Judgment 2, Emily Vargas. Sued him for draining her retirement account after proposing to her. Both women ruined. Both women left with nothing while he vanished. Is this true? Benjamin whispered, turning his head slowly to look at Gabriel. The blind trust in my father's eyes was completely gone, replaced by a dawning, horrifying realization. They were crazy. Gabriel stammered, his polished voice cracking into a pathetic whine. They didn't understand the risks of venture capital. Business goes south sometimes, Benjamin, you know that. She's just trying to frame me to keep the money. I have the certified court records right here, I said, dropping the heavy stack of papers onto the table. He targeted our family because he found out I owned a successful firm. He couldn't get to my money directly because I refused to play his games. So, he used the 3 of you. He manipulated your entitlement, Mom and Dad. He knew you felt you had a right to my money, and he used that to make you commit a federal crime on his behalf. Quinn stared at the papers, her hands trembling. She looked at Gabriel, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. She saw the sweat on his brow, the desperate, guilty shift of his eyes. Gabriel, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't steal from those women. Gabriel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just looked at the door, clearly calculating if he could run. The spell was broken. The grand illusion Gabriel had woven was shattered into a million pieces on my living room floor. And as my parents stared at the irrefutable proof of his deception, the true gravity of their own actions finally crashed down upon them. They hadn't just secured a house for their golden child. They had handed a con artist the keys to their own complete destruction, and the federal government was already knocking on the door. The silence in my living room was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Gabriel was backed against my front door, his hand hovering nervously over the brass doorknob. The polished, arrogant smirk he had worn just 10 minutes ago had completely melted away, replaced by the cornered, feral look of a trapped animal. I need to make a phone call, Gabriel stammered, his voice lacking any of its usual smooth, commanding bravado. My legal team. I need to get my legal team on this right now. There's been a massive overreach by your bank. You don't have a legal team, Gabriel, I said, my voice hoarse from the coughing but completely steady. I leaned heavily against the back of my armchair, the fever still making the room spin slightly, but my mind had never been sharper. You have public defenders who represented you in your last 2 civil fraud cases, and I don't think they handle federal corporate embezzlement or wire fraud. Benjamin, do something. Helen shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the small apartment. She clutched the lapels of her expensive cardigan, her eyes darting frantically between me and Gabriel. Tell her to stop this. Tell her to call the bank and tell them it was a simple mistake. We are going to lose Quinn's house in an hour. Benjamin, however, was not looking at me. For the first time in my entire life, my father's furious, indignant glare was not directed at his oldest daughter. It was fixed squarely on the man in the tailored navy suit. The sheer weight of the court documents resting on my glass coffee table seemed to have finally anchored him to reality, piercing through years of his own stubborn pride. We aren't calling anyone from here, Benjamin growled, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying, unfamiliar rage. He took a heavy step toward the door, physically blocking Gabriel's exit. "We are going down to the credit union. Right now, in person. We are going to sit in front of the branch manager, and we are going to get to the bottom of exactly what you made my wife sign, Gabriel." "I didn't make her sign anything." Gabriel shot back, his hands raised defensively. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it almost sounded natural. "She volunteered. She said it was family money sitting dormant. I am just a consultant. I advise. I don't authorize financial transfers." I watched the color completely drain from my mother's face. The man she had treated like absolute royalty, the man she had stolen my life savings to please, had just thrown her directly into the path of a federal investigation without a single second of hesitation. You told me it was a legal loophole," Helen whispered, her voice trembling so violently I could barely hear her. "You said Isabella was hoarding it illegally to avoid taxes. You gave me the routing numbers to your escrow account." "I am going to get dressed," I announced, breaking the tense, horrifying standoff. I pulled my fleece blanket tighter around my shoulders and began walking toward my bedroom. "I need to file an in-person affidavit of fraud to protect my LLC's charter anyway. Let's all go. Let's see how well Gabriel's consultant defense holds up under federal banking scrutiny." The car ride to the local credit union branch was the most excruciatingly silent 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the back seat next to a weeping, shell-shocked Quinn, wearing a heavy winter coat and a medical mask to protect others from my lingering pneumonia. In the front, Benjamin gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white, while Gabriel sat in the passenger seat, aggressively texting on his phone, his leg bouncing with panicked energy. When we pushed through the heavy double glass doors of the credit union, the lobby was bustling with mid-morning customers. It was a highly public arena, the exact kind of place where my parents usually demanded absolute decorum and quiet respectability. Not today. We approached the main teller line, but before Benjamin could even speak, a side door opened and Mr. Henderson, the branch manager who had known my family for over 20 years, stepped out into the lobby. He looked absolutely devastated. He held a thick stack of red-flagged printouts in his shaking hands. "Benjamin." "Helen," Mr. Henderson said, his voice carrying a solemn, devastating weight that made several nearby customers turn their heads. "I was just about to request the authorities be dispatched to your home. Please step into my office. Right now." "There's no need for the office, Henderson," Gabriel suddenly and loudly interrupted, stepping right in front of my father. He plastered on a fake, desperate smile, raising his voice so the entire lobby could hear him clearly. "This is all a massive familial misunderstanding. My mother-in-law here, Helen, simply got confused with some routing numbers. If you could just release the freeze on the wire, we can clear this up quietly without involving the corporate compliance board." "Quietly?" Mr. Henderson echoed, his eyebrows shooting up to his hairline. He looked past Gabriel in disgust, locking eyes with me. "Isabella, my legal compliance team received the emergency injunction from your corporate attorney 40 minutes ago. The Department of the Treasury has already issued a formal, irrevocable freeze on the receiving escrow account. This isn't a bank issue anymore. It's a federal jurisdiction issue." "Because she lied," Gabriel suddenly yelled, pivoting to point a shaking finger directly at my face. The polished veneer was completely gone. He was a desperate, cornered rat, shouting in a crowded bank. "She's hiding assets. She's committing tax fraud, and we just happened to stumble upon it. Helen authorized the transfer because she is a joint account holder. It's perfectly legal." The entire bank lobby had fallen dead silent. Dozens of eyes were locked onto our family. I calmly stepped forward, unzipping my coat slightly to reach into my heavy tote bag. I pulled out the thick manila folder of Gabriel's background check and dropped it onto one of the lobby's marble check-writing stands with a resounding slap. "This man," I said, my voice echoing clearly and coldly across the silent room, "is Gabriel Vance, also known as Gabriel Mercer. He has 3 bankruptcies and 2 active civil judgments for defrauding women out of their life savings." He manipulated my mother into using an archaic, dormant legacy charter to illegally access a federally protected corporate tax holding account belonging to my limited liability company. He orchestrated the theft of $184,000 to fund his own private real estate purchase. Gabriel lunged forward, trying to grab the folder, but Benjamin suddenly grabbed him by the collar of his expensive suit, violently shoving him back into the center of the lobby. "Don't you dare touch her," Benjamin roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. The sheer, devastating betrayal in my father's eyes was absolute. "He's a liar, Dad." Gabriel screamed, struggling against Benjamin's grip, spit flying from his lips. "She's the criminal." Helen signed the paper. "Helen is the one who committed wire fraud. If anyone is going to federal prison, it's your wife. I just gave her advice. I'm completely insulated. She's the one going down for this." A sharp, piercing gasp tore through the air. It was Quinn. My sister, who had spent the last 2 years treating Gabriel like a god, who had defended his every move, mocked my suspicions, and demanded my money to fund his lifestyle, stood trembling in the center of the lobby. She stared at Gabriel, her eyes wide with absolute, horrifying clarity. She finally heard the words coming out of his mouth. He was fully, eagerly prepared to send her mother to federal prison just to save his own skin. Quinn walked forward, her steps slow and heavy. Gabriel looked at her, furiously adjusting his suit jacket, trying to muster a reassuring, manipulative smile. "Quinn, baby, listen to me. They are trying to ruin our future, our dream house." "Stop talking," Quinn whispered. The golden child, who had never raised her voice in anger in her entire life, suddenly pulled her arm back and delivered a resounding, echoing slap directly across Gabriel's face. The sound cracked like a whip through the silent bank. Gabriel stumbled backward, clutching his cheek in pure shock. "You used me," Quinn sobbed, her voice breaking with an agony that finally felt entirely genuine. "You used my parents. You tried to destroy my sister. We are done. Do not ever speak to me again." She turned to Mr. Henderson, tears streaming down her face, her voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "Call the police. Please, call them right now." Gabriel didn't wait. Seeing the entire illusion collapse and realizing the authorities were imminent, he turned and sprinted for the heavy glass doors, bursting out into the parking lot like a coward fleeing a burning building. I stood perfectly still, the fever finally breaking into a cold, shivering sweat. The showdown was over. The truth was out in the open, undeniable and absolute, under the bright fluorescent lights of the bank lobby. The trap had not only sprung, it had completely dismantled the toxic dynamic that had suffocated me for my entire life. The aftermath of that morning in the credit union was swift, brutal, and entirely dictated by the merciless machinery of federal law. Gabriel didn't make it very far. By fleeing the bank in a panic, he only escalated the situation and drew immediate attention to himself. When the bank's fraud investigators officially forwarded my attorney's compiled dossier to the local authorities, they discovered Gabriel had an outstanding bench warrant in a neighboring state for ignoring a subpoena related to his previous civil judgments. He was apprehended at a cheap, roadside motel 3 days later, attempting to wire the last of his meager personal funds to an untraceable offshore account. The federal prosecutors eagerly added conspiracy to commit corporate wire fraud to his rapidly growing list of charges. With his history of flight, he was denied bail, completely ruined, and facing a very long time behind bars. For my parents, the consequences were devastating, though entirely of their own making. The Department of the Treasury did not care about family misunderstandings or parental entitlement. Helen's signature was physically on the wire authorization, and Benjamin was listed as an active co-conspirator for driving her to the bank and orchestrating the destination of the stolen funds. Because I absolutely refused to drop the corporate theft charges, knowing full well that doing so would legally implicate my own LLC in tax evasion and fraud, they faced the full brunt of the federal investigation. They avoided prison time only by accepting a crippling, humiliating plea deal that included massive restitution fines, 5 years of strict federal probation, and a permanent felony mark on Helen's record. To pay their exorbitant legal defense fees and the government fines, they had to sell their comfortable, suburban home and move into a cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. Their retirement savings were entirely obliterated. They had tried to steal my future to fund their blatant favoritism, and in doing so, they had completely bankrupted themselves. My funds, of course, were fully restored. Once the federal investigators reviewed my meticulous, time-stamped accounting records and Marcus's swift legal injunctions, the freeze on the escrow account was lifted. The $184,000 was safely returned to my LLC's holding account just in time to pay the IRS. I immediately closed the dormant legacy account, severing the last financial vulnerability I had to my parents forever. 2 months later, the deep, rattling cough of my pneumonia had finally faded, replaced by the quiet, productive hum of my home office. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my apartment intercom buzzed. It was Quinn. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the button, before finally pressing unlock. When I opened my front door, she stood in the hallway, looking utterly different from the entitled, demanding girl who had barged in with champagne all those weeks ago. She looked tired, humbled, and deeply sorrowful. She wasn't wearing expensive designer clothes purchased with our parents' debt. She wore a simple sweater and jeans. "Hi, Isabella," she said softly, clutching a small, insulated paper cup. "I brought you some tea. Real tea, not whatever I was doing before." I stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. We sat at my kitchen island in silence for several long minutes, the only sound the patter of rain against the windows. "Mom and Dad are moving on Friday," Quinn finally said, her voice strained and thick with emotion. It's really bad, Isabella. They blame Gabriel entirely, of course, but I know they blame themselves, too. They just won't admit it out loud." "They made a choice, Quinn," I replied, my voice gentle but entirely firm. "I can't save them from the consequences of that choice. Not anymore. I never should have had to in the first place." "I know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek and falling onto the countertop. "I came here to apologize, properly. I was so unbelievably arrogant. I was so wrapped up in Gabriel's lies, in the fantasy of that luxury house, that I didn't care who got hurt. I let them treat you like a bank account. I treated you like a bank account. And I am so sorry." I looked at my younger sister. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't see the golden child. I saw a young woman whose entire world had shattered, who was finally waking up to the harsh reality of the toxic entitlement we had been raised in. "I forgive you, Quinn," I said, and to my own surprise, I found that I truly meant it. The heavy, suffocating resentment that had weighed on my chest for years seemed to have finally lifted. But things are going to be different now. I am not the family safety net. I will never be the financial backup plan again. We can be sisters, but the money stops here, permanently. Quinn nodded rapidly, a look of profound, genuine relief washing over her face. "I don't want your money, Isabella. I got a job, a real one, at a local marketing firm. Entry level. I start on Monday. I just want my sister back." I reached across the island and placed my hand over hers. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It was the beginning of something new, something built on reality rather than manipulation and greed. When Quinn finally left, the apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't a lonely quiet. It was deeply peaceful. I walked over to my heavy mahogany desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and looked at my business dashboard. The numbers were strong, the accounts were locked down and secure, and my future was entirely my own. I had faced the ultimate betrayal, standing alone against the people who were supposed to protect me. But I hadn't just survived. I had dismantled their deception with absolute precision, ensuring that the only person who would ever control my life and my hard-earned success was me.